would probably...
All right.
Oh,
Good
John.
afternoon, everybody. How are we all today?
Good afternoon, everyone. We have a very special guest today. I will introduce him in just a second. His name is Kolya, and he has been a friend of mine for, I want to say, about 4 years now. And Kolya is... I'll let him introduce himself. He has done a lot of really good things. He is actually from the hometown of my maternal great-grandfather, and an area that I spend a lot of time in. So, Kolya, if you can introduce yourself, talk a little bit about your history, your career and things like this.
Hi everyone, my name is Mykola, and I'm from Ukraine. Thank you for this opportunity to join your podcast and to spread this word about the situation in Ukraine. But first, before I introduce myself and tell about my life in Ukraine, I would like to have this few minutes of a brief recap of Ukrainian history. Not like Putin did in his interview, but something really important. If someone of you is familiar with this term, executed Renaissance, after Second World War, Russia all the time tried to suppress Ukrainian people, and they succeed in this. They killed a lot of our writers and other people who were not just common peasants. And they kept doing that until like 1985, when I believe Vasil Stus died in Soviet camps. And this was something really fascinating about Ukraine, that Ukrainian people, they always had this idea of independence. But when Soviet Union collapsed, it was, no one expected that. And Ukrainian society wasn't really ready for that. They didn't fight for it. So after Soviet Union collapsed, Ukraine had these hard times of criminal activity. What I mean that everyone knows that in 90s we had this mafia, and also we had this former party officials who now were involved in capitalism, and in Ukraine it was like mostly organized crime. For many years, they killed each other. They tried to gain control over everything, like factories, property, land. And those who survived these cruel times, they were like the most skilled mafiosi of all. And they became Ukraine elite. So all this we have to remember when we will talk today about modern Ukraine officials, about former presidents, and so on.
I would like you. Go ahead. I would actually like you to definitely, because this is a topic I think a lot of Americans, they don't, and a lot of Westerners, they don't really know exactly how violent Ukraine was during the 1990s. And you and I are about the same age, and you grew up, in Priluki.
I grew up in Priluki, yeah, and Priluki was one of the most criminalist cities in Ukraine, and we even called it Little Odessa. And as you know, Odessa was very criminal city. When I was studying in school, like in 5th or 6th grade, I saw a dead body in a restaurant. Someone just threw a grenade there. That's how this criminal activity was done. People were shot on the street. Like yesterday, he was owner of a factory. Now he is dead, so someone took his factory, and that's how it continued. When Kuchma was the president, Kuchma actually benefited a lot to the rise of this criminal empire, especially from the eastern regions of Ukraine. And we really had a chance when Yushchenko became president. He was poisoned, and then we saw how Russia started to pay the Ukrainian pro-Russian parties to fund them, tried various forms of economic blockades against Ukrainian business. Eventually, Yanukovych became president. That was also fault of Yushchenko and Tymoshenko because they tried to become presidents as well, so they lost. And I remember how we felt at the time. It was like 2011, I believe. I was graduating from university, Yanukovych was president, and I felt like Ukraine has no future at the time because we all knew that Yanukovych is a product of this 90s, essence of these criminals, of mafia, and so on.
He was
at that point, I decided to move to Russia. Yes.
He was actually himself when he was younger, he was arrested for robbing, like actually armed robbery of a woman. He himself was Yanukovych was actually a criminal. About Yushchenko, I think that he had a lot of good ideas, but he did a lot to divide the country and actually create a lot of the tension that we would later see in Donbass. I think his and me, Kolya, that I support the Ukrainian language. I gave up learning Russian to learn Ukrainian, and but I think that Yushchenko did a lot of things to divide the country. I think though, as far as a human being, he was a lot better than most of Ukraine's presidents. His big problem also was allying himself with Tymoshenko. Tymoshenko, I think you can definitely tell the audience, is a big criminal, and some of Priluki's major criminals are, tied with her.
Associates.
Yeah, they're associates.
Yes.
And that's why, when I never knew that, but when I was living in the United States, I never knew anything about Tymoshenko. I just thought that she was like some poor woman who was put in jail wrongly. And later on, when I heard about, some of the people in Priluki and, their ties with her, I know that she's an evil human being because only an evil person could be, working with some of these people in Priluki. That's, that there's no other way to really explain it. But I wanted to ask you, so that's one thing a lot of people don't know is, when the Soviet Union collapsed, there were a lot of armories and various military technology that people could just take. There were no there was no nobody actually guarding these warehouses. So in Priluki, you had incidences of grenade attacks and use of military weapons, that it was something that when I heard it for the first time, I was absolutely shocked. I shouldn't have been surprised because it's Ukraine in the 90s, but I was still very shocked. I actually know a person, I won't mention his name, but he was a former member of one of these criminal groups. He was a kind of a local enforcer. He was shot 7 times, stabbed several times in the stomach. And while he was recovering in the hospital, some of the criminals went to his house and threw a grenade through the window, but he happened not to be there, so he wasn't killed. But I'm thinking this is a guy who he escaped. He was a paratrooper, a desantnik, during the 1980s. He was not sent to Afghanistan, but he would end up seeing more violence in Priluki than a lot of people ever did in Afghanistan. So yeah, it's an interesting place. I would like you to explain, a little bit about why you decided to go to Russia, what it was like living in Russia in the early 2010s, and talk about your experience with people there. I'm really curious about it, and then maybe get into a little bit about some of the similarities and then the major differences between Ukrainians and Russians.
Yes. After I graduated from university, I just couldn't find myself in Ukraine because salary was low. We were after this world crisis of 2008. So I decided, why not? Why not to try to go to Moscow? And I always like to make this point. I didn't go to Russia to work. I went to Moscow. Because a lot of people from former Soviet Union, even after 20 years it collapsed, they went to Moscow because all the companies were there, all money of former Soviet Union was there, and you had much more better opportunities, job opportunities as well. Well, about differences, I didn't notice them at the beginning. The thing is, when you live in one big city, for example, Kyiv, and then you move to another big city, language is similar. A border with Europe was closed at that point. I didn't have experience of visiting European countries. So I just worked hard. I didn't really have time to do some research. I even couldn't go to a movie or something. It was hard work at the construction. Later, I moved to an office. I had more free time. I found a girl, and we started to live together. It happened to be my future wife. So when I worked in the office, I also always had this argues about the time of revolution in Ukraine. As you remember, Yanukovych was the president when I left. I always tried to go home to meet my friends, and I spoke to one of them. I said, like, why nothing is happening? Yanukovych is the president. There must be a revolution or something. And it happened like in 2 years after our conversation. I was reading all the news. I was following all of that. We already started to live together. I was waiting for a son. We were paying off the apartment. We had a loan for it. So I was pretty connected to Moscow at that point. So the revolution of 2014, it showed me I was in Moscow. I was working with local people. Some of them were former Ukrainians that moved like in 80s when it was the Soviet Union or so. And I had this opportunity to see their reaction on all this that happened. And at that point, a massive propagandist company started all TV channels. They were speaking about American money, about this revolution is paid by CIA, about the American government, and all the stuff. I just knew that it felt right because when students were beaten on the square, people had to do something. In half of year, when I had a vacation, I took my wife and we went to the main square, to Kyiv. We just
to Maidan
with this revolutionary air, and I knew that even if people will be shot on that square, no one will hide and no one will go home. In opposite, in Russia, in this huge, huge city, Moscow is much more bigger than Kyiv. They had this episode like Bolotna Square with white stripes. I don't even remember what they tried to show there. and there was this viral video with one guy, one policeman, going after the huge amount of people with only one stick, and they were all running from him. It was so funny to watch. If you saw these videos from our revolution, they were trying to take this square with different military vehicles, and people had this Molotov cocktails thrown at the military vehicle. They were standing to the death. That's how you can compare two nations.
Yeah, Ukraine and Russia.
Ukrainians, they are very tough, and Russians, it's more like slavery. How I feel this. You can have this opportunity to live rich, to be wealth, but for that you have to leave your hometown, your home region, and go to Moscow, to St. Petersburg, to any region center that is rich, like Yekaterinburg and just few other cities, like 4 or 5 cities in entire huge Russia. In Ukraine, you don't have this big difference. You live pretty much the same in Lviv or in Kharkiv or in Kiev, maybe 15%, 20% difference in salary. But in Russia, it was like 4 times or 5 times bigger salary in Moscow.
From what
That's
I
why
know,
actually
yeah.
I went to Moscow to earn some money.
Yeah, from what I know, Moscow is almost like a different world from the rest of Russia.
Yes, yes, totally.
Yeah. How many? I've also heard, like, just from you, but there was a lot of Ukrainians or former Ukrainians that live in Moscow, right?
Yeah, I was surprised to see that almost every second white person I saw there, they had relatives in Ukraine. They moved from Ukraine, or their parents moved from Ukraine, and it was really strange because there were a lot of immigrants from Asia. Russia itself has different regions like Tatarstan, Buryatia, and so on. Those people, they are not Slavic. And Russia, at that time as well, they had this idea about Russia as a European country because they are Slavs. Which is strange because it's like only 15% of the population of Russia are really Slavs. I never could understand why are they trying to hold up to this idea of their Slavish history. Because in Ukraine, for me, it was strange. Like, it is a mono nation. When you come to Ukraine, you see Ukrainians. We always welcome all different people. There are no culture conflicts based on who is from what country. The opposite in Moscow, for example, after this terrorist attack at Crocus City Hall, they started to conflict with different nationalities who actually are working migrants in Russia. I saw that on the news lately, and I believe that it is okay for Russians, but it would be never okay for Ukrainians.
Well, if I could, there's a particular. Russia's a very large country with a very large diverse ethnic background. But typically, when we think of Russia, we think of Moscow and we think of St. Petersburg.
We also think
the examples of Russian cities. So, you mentioned that you moved to Moscow to work, and that's not necessarily wider Russia. I think that's a really good point, because Moscow is a very particular environment that feels very connected to European history in a lot of ways because of things like Napoleon or Germany in World War II.
I want to say
there's an impression that this is, despite the fact that Russia really straddles 2 very different worlds, in the form of Asia and then Europe, that they are European, and that's an impression that Russians want to have too, I think.
I want to say too that in Ukraine there is there are some of the same stereotypes that Russians have towards these like Caucasus ethnic groups and like Central Asian ethnic groups, but I didn't see a whole lot of conflict. Like in Priluki, there's, for example, several Armenian families, and I've never heard they don't seem to be treated as different. Whereas my girlfriend, she she was born in Baku and then moved to a small like rayon center outside of I think it was I forget the actual town, but she was treated horribly. All the Armenians that moved there were treated absolutely horrible. I have not seen that really in Ukraine. Definitely I would caution someone if they like were, say, of African or, Indian descent to go to a smaller locality. Like I wouldn't advise them to go to Priluki unless they knew some people there. But like, it's not the overt like racism is not as strong, I would say, in Ukraine as it is in Russia, because you have a lot of more of these minority ethnic groups going there for work, and there's a very large conflict, between them and the Slavic population there. The interesting thing about Slavic Russians too is they don't really like see any difference between themselves and Belarusians and Ukrainians. And because of this, they think, oh, it's totally fine if we go and, invade Ukraine because, they're our brothers and they'll accept us. They're just Russians. They just want to be part of us. And that's kind of, it's kind of a really sick mentality that they have, where they think it's okay because it's Russia anyway to them, that they can just go into someone else's sovereign country and, take it for themselves.
I believe they just don't have it in their mentality. They have it as a result of a certain education, as it was in Soviet Union, and now it is in modern Russia. Once I had an opportunity to read the history book, and I found no pages about Ukraine, and it was some cities like Kiev, Chernihiv, but they never referred to it like of something that exists without Russia.
Of course.
And for me, it was pretty strange because even though I had in my school times all these myths and nostalgic stories from my teachers about superiority of Soviet Union, that I actually never experienced myself because we had all these fancy cars from Europe on our streets, all the cell phones from Western world. I never thought about Soviet civilization, Soviet world as about superior to others, because definitely what I saw that in capitalistic world there were these huge giants economically, these countries like United States, England, France, Germany, even Japan is part of this capitalistic world. But Russia and Ukraine, they just trade with grain and oil. It's not something that I would say these are countries who sell resources. They are not superior in any way to other parts. But in Russia, they actually believe they are superior. And that's also strange for me.
They believe that they're morally superior and culturally superior. It's kind of like, they know that they're living in shit, but like they believe that, they're okay with that as long as
everyone else lives in shit too. And it's worse shit.
And I was just going to say, what always astounded me about Ukraine is, I've met just as many people in Ukraine, older people, especially in a place like Priluki, where, like, when I asked them about, the Soviet times, like I've had people like Kolya, like our parents' age, like, you know, people who were born in the 1950s and 60s, and they'll have tears in their eyes because they'll talk about how nice their life was, you know, how easy it was for them, you know, during that time. And I'm just like, I'm thinking, you know, because overall the Ukrainian Soviet experiment, you have, of course, the Stalinist period, you have the Holodomor, where, you know, like at minimum 3.9 to 4 million people die, you know, of starvation that is brought on by the Soviet state. It's brought on, you know, by forced grain requisition, by, you know, blockading whole villages, you know, all these draconian things. And it's something that both of our relatives, you know, lived through. Yours even probably far worse than mine. Mine were in Priluki itself, so it wasn't as bad as in the villages. But, you know, like, Ukraine it was a tough time. But after Stalin dies, you know, things get easier, and then the generation after, they have like pretty good, I mean, not by Western standards, like if they would have seen what my I mean, at least like what my mother's family and like what, you know, what the United States was like at the same time, they would have seen the difference. But you don't know any better, you know. They didn't see like how the wet rest of the world was, so to them it was an easier, less stressful time than you know, independence. And I remember too, even some of these older people, like your grandmother's age. I just had Katya Malarova, our friend in Priluki. She interviewed an older woman who had survived the German occupation for me, and you know, her father was actually like a communist. Like I think he was some military commissar, and so she did grow up in this family. But what she told me, what she says at the end, you know, because, you know, I was, you know, asking Katya, you know, to ask her, you know, what was it like, you know, 1947. There was 2 famines, by the way, for the viewers who don't know that. Actually 3 famines in Ukraine. The first one was in the 1920s. Then the big one was 1932-33. And then there was a post-war famine as well, that killed less people than the other 2. But you know what this woman said is like, you know, how is Stalin bad? How is he worse than these people that we have now? And I've heard older people in Ukraine say that, who have, like, you know, seen them both. And to me, you know, it's to me as an American, it's crazy. I'm not gonna lie to you, it's crazy because, you know. But I guess when you grow up, you know, and you're under this propaganda, you believe it and you carry those beliefs till you die, you know. And this woman wasn't the only one that I've encountered like that. I don't know, can you comment on that, Kolya?
Well, actually, in my village, I know the story about few old women who told that they had a good time just when Germans were here, because they were paid every week for their labor. And Germans, they asked them questions about this famine, and they told them they saw it in the news on TV, and our people, they didn't knew what TV was. So actually, the history is written by victorious, and I don't really know which part of that is true. Anyway, what certainly Russians have, they have this education, this propaganda that makes them believe that they are superior in any way to all other nations. That's what I felt when I was working there. For example, my boss, she asked me at one of these companies where I worked, Nikolai, you worked in Russia you lived in Russia for 6 years. So why you still have Ukrainian citizenship and you didn't get Russian? I never thought about getting Russian citizenship, and even my wife is Russian. So I told her, well, you know, if they would offer me American citizenship, I would agree. But why should I trade Ukrainian to Russian? And you should see her face. when you tell someone in Russia that Ukrainians are same equal to Russian in all the ways possible, and this my blue passport is has same value as the red passport, they just don't get it. They consider Moscow is like the most advanced economy, most cultural advanced part of the world, and so on. But they just have this McDonald's in Moscow that we have in Kiev. I never thought about Moscow like about more advanced. Rich, yes, they have more money, definitely. They have maybe more cinemas, they have more something, but there are a lot of theaters in Kiev, and culturally, I would prefer Kiev, for example, to Moscow, because Moscow is just too big. You can't live in this huge city and tell that you're culturally superior to anyone else. I wouldn't say it's about St. Petersburg. It's a really beautiful city. And have you ever been to St. Petersburg?
No, I've never been to either Moscow or St. Petersburg, but I have relatives in both of whom are descended from Preluki relatives.
Well, with that,
I've been to one thing I wanted to mention, Daedalus. I've been to Kaliningrad, which is a completely sort of different city. It used to be a East Prussia, but obviously because it was destroyed so much during the Second World War, they the center was rebuilt and kind of made in that old European style, but the outskirts are very much like something you would see, not anything different from what you would see in Russia or in like Kiev even. And I didn't really feel that much of a difference, between Kaliningrad and some of the Ukrainian cities that I've visited. I'm sure Moscow is probably slightly different, but yeah, I know, like, for example, that, people are certainly more friendly in Kiev than they are in Moscow. Definitely, though, Kiev is not my favorite city in Ukraine. Far from it.
Well, with that, I think we probably need to move into one of the principal differences right now between Ukrainians and Russians is that they're at war. And let's kind of move into that at this point, I think, is probably a good idea. So yeah, go ahead.
At that point, I was living in Moscow, and I started to think about going back to Ukraine because I love Ukraine very much. And after Yanukovych had to run from Ukraine, and he was really supported by all this media, all this news, all these channels, I felt that Russians, they stepped into this new propaganda life, info space, where they now are told that Ukrainians are bad, that Ukrainians betrayed Russia, that Ukrainians sold themselves to United States. And I heard that from just common Russians, that you, like prostitutes, you sold yourself to America for this dirty money and stuff instead of being with your allies. And it continued to grow. At that point, I started to realize in what country I really live. I was afraid to speak Ukrainian in street, despite I had little son and I wanted him to hear Ukrainian language from his first year, so he would learn it as well.
This was 2014.
So I decided, no, it's like more 2016. I had to figure out how to move to Ukraine because in Ukraine I didn't have any friends and job opportunities that would allow me to exist. So I joined in 2015 to my Kyiv Polytechnical University. I decided that I now want to study for programmer, which I did. And in 2018, I graduated. It was my third education. And after that, I just didn't go back to Russia. I decided I'm staying in Ukraine. I offered to my wife to go to Ukraine, and it wasn't, her reaction wasn't what I actually expected, because as every Russians, even my wife, they consider life in Ukraine something less attractive than life in Russia. And I understood that. So at that point, I was in Ukraine by myself. I actually didn't stay there for a long time. I moved back to Moscow for like 6 months to stay with my kids, and my wife started to work again. And at that time, I decided I'm not giving up. I just want to live in Ukraine. And I opened my programming school in Proluki. I started with 13 children as my students. Before war, I had more than 100 students. So I believe I succeeded in that one. Anyway, at this point, what we should think about, after Yanukovych, president, ran away from Ukraine, Russia started their slow invasion. For all of these years, our government, all of those parties we had in our parliament, they were parts of huge criminal organizations. For example, this Yulia Tymoshenko is a great example of a person who made fortune of stealing gas, or their other people. I don't know about Poroshenko. He was all the time involved in some activities with different guys from Partia Regionev, where Yanukovych was from. And from them all, Yushchenko was the only one, I believe, educated person who really knew something in economics. But he never decided to step into and do enough. When you mentioned before, Gregory, that Yushchenko divided Ukrainians because of the language question, I believe opposite was happening. Russia divided Ukrainians because after first Maidan, Russia started their propaganda information campaign over eastern and southern regions of Ukraine. And they were pretty loyal to Russia. They were sympathizing Russia at the time. I believe a lot of them still do, which is crazy, actually.
Oh, for
But that's
sure.
just because in Soviet Union, they did this policy when they just took a lot of people from some region and they moved them to another region. For example, like Crimeans, they were moved to Siberia. And the same way, they took a lot of people from Russia and they moved them to Donbass, so to work in those facilities. And that's why these regions are Russian-speaking.
It was even beforehand too. Even during the Tsarist, the imperial era, they a lot of people from the Russian interior came there to work in the coal mines. So even then, it was already, especially in the cities, it was already very Russified. But during the Soviet times, even there were population movements even to villages and stuff like that that have had suffered attrition during the famine. So yeah, there are those reasons. I remember though a friend of mine who had visited Crimea in the 90s, he had told me how he saw, he was on a bus and two girls from Western Ukraine came on the bus, obvious Ukrainian speakers, and the bus driver just yelled at them for speaking Ukrainian and, just was scolding them, and some other people too on the bus were. And what my friend said is that he knew then that Ukraine lost Crimea long before then because, they didn't promote any sort of like pro-Ukrainian policies, and you have that mentality of people there. I actually have a somewhat controversial viewpoint in regards to Crimea. I think that Ukraine would be probably better without it, because Crimea and then also these, regions like the DNR and LNR, they always voted against the interests of the rest of the country.
Yes, I think so as well. It might be sounds like a treason, but at this question, I would agree with you. These regions, they were repopulated in Soviet times, and if you will take a look at the map of Ukraine, you can see the cities like Kyiv, Chernihiv, Poltava, Cherkasy, Sumy, and maybe Dnipro and Kherson and Odessa. But all those cities that are on the eastern part and eastern southern part, that were the cities that were populated mostly before the Soviet Union and at the period of the Soviet Union. And those people, they might be not natively Ukrainians, but anyway, they voted for Ukrainian independence as well, because they hoped to get this independence from Russia in Soviet Union, from Soviet Russia, and to work for themselves. They thought they will be rich when they will do that. But because of the lack of education, and we never had those capitalist educational system, people in Ukraine in the 90s, they didn't know what is the market, how to live in this without this planned economy that Soviet Union had. So that's why they were very frustrated. They were desperate. There was crisis. They had to work and not get paid. It's also played its role in this 2014 and 15 attack of Russia, when Russian troops, they actually had a lot of support. They still do in
they
eastern
still
regions.
do. Yeah, that's one thing I want to mention to people here, is that in those regions, they still do have support there, even in the places that they blew to pieces. So, for example, even in Mariupol, there are a lot of people that supported them. Even in places like, Bakhmut, all those areas, a lot of the locals, even at best, they have the mentality that, it doesn't matter to me who runs this place as long as I get my pension. And they have
and in Russia, this pension will be bigger. They believe that even if their house will be destroyed and so on,
the pension will be bigger. Yeah, and that's the crazy thing about it. And I've talked to friends in the army who, when they're there, even in the areas that are under Ukrainian control, they feel scared because they know that some of the locals do not like them. They know that, for example, that their positions even at times are reported on to the Russians, and they get shelled because of this. So it's a very scary situation. A lot of people thought, and I think Russians thought, that this situation would be the same in Chernihiv Oblast, or in Sumy region, or Kharkiv. And
no, not Chernihiv. Chernihiv is the oldest Ukrainian city, one of the oldest. And
it is, yeah.
If we speak with this accent like Russian and Belarusians, it's just because we live near this border. But in mentality, in Chernihiv, people, they are like the most Ukrainian people you can find in Ukraine, because we eat salo, and it's like, wow. I'm joking, of course, but when in Russia, what's the funny thing about Ukrainians who move to Russia, they start to think not about soil, about ground, how to work on the ground. They start to think about pension. And when this magic happens, when people just stop working, in Russia, people don't work as hard as Ukrainians do. It's crazy. But when you go to village, and I visited few Russian villages, they just don't grow anything. potatoes and so on. For me, it's like the strangest thing I ever saw. They don't have chickens, they don't have like local little family farms, they don't grow pigs. They just wait for their pension. And as the government sells a lot of gas and oil, they get paid just to live, to drink, to
do nothing,
repopulate. That's all. So this is one more strange thing about Russia. I noticed they just don't like to work. In Ukraine, everyone works. Everyone do something.
I want you to highlight a little bit too. So, like, you know, I always have a sense of pride when you mention that Chernihiv Oblast is the most Ukrainian, or like Poltava Oblast is the most Ukrainian. But to me, the people there, and I don't mean to insult anyone from Western Ukraine, but I'm just going to be, you know, subjective on this. I really I like people from central, northern Ukraine more than I like people from Western Ukraine. People in Western Ukraine are a little bit too nationalistic for me. They're a little bit too stupid with that. And I think that you have the right sort of amount of patriotism in like Chernihiv Oblast. It's not crazy, you know. Me and you have talked about this a little bit too. I want to know a little bit about can you highlight a little bit about the differences between Eastern, Central, and Western Ukraine?
Well, historically, it just happens, and Ukraine was separated for a long time between Russia and Poland. When I visited Poland, maybe there was some things that I can now see in people who live in Western Ukraine that are pretty similar to Polish culture. It's just Ukraine was always the matter of conflict. Everyone wanted Ukraine as a prize for hundreds of years, and it's happened. So in this region, we were under Russian rule, and western part of Ukraine was under Polish rule, and so on. I see the difference, but I love the same people from my region, from Lviv region. For me, they all Ukrainians, and unless they start talking Russian and about love to Russia and some stupid things, that's what I don't like. In Kyiv, there are a lot of young people who speak Russian until today. Can you imagine that? They are so ignorant. They don't understand that this war will continue until the last Russian-speaking Ukrainian region will be conquered by Russia. Because why did they fled from Chernihiv region? It is very close to Russia. Look at the map. It's strategically pretty easy to win it, to take it over by military way. But they fled. Why? Because in here, no one wants Russia. No one.
No, people
Maybe
realize
there are some traitors. But why do this eastern region suffer so much? Because they were always so tolerant to Russians.
how many people
both sides.
How many people now are speaking Russian in Kiev still? Because when I was there before the war, it was still the majority of what I heard was Russian. In Chernihiv too, actually. Living in Chernihiv, I actually regretted it. It's kind of like one of my biggest regrets. You know, I didn't get to I was planning on spending like 3 to 4 years in Ukraine, and I kind of regret choosing Chernihiv. And had the war not happened, I certainly would have moved to Priluki, actually, because it's my ancestral homeland. And I know so much more people there. You know, I walk on the streets and I'm kind of a little celebrity because, you know, it's you know, a smaller place, and I'm pretty active on their social media. So like, they know who I am, and you know, it is a Ukrainian speaking town. It's a Surzhyk speaking town, but it's you know, it's still a place.
It's a kind of dialect, yeah.
Yeah, it's a place that you can use Ukrainian. I used it, of course, in Chernihiv. It's not a problem. In Kiev, it's not a problem. But the vast majority of people that I heard on the streets were speaking Russian, and I've heard it's changed now in Chernihiv. That, like, a lot of people after the siege have switched to Ukrainian. But I really would like to visit and see that myself. I have to do it at some point. I feel like if I don't go there to visit, I might not ever have that chance given the situation. But
I hope you will.
Yeah.
Well, there are a lot of people still speaking Russian in Kyiv. I don't know about Chernihiv. I wasn't there for a long time. But the policy of our government is moving to a right direction. They try to implement like no tolerance to Russian language in all educational facilities in Ukraine. I didn't mention it before, but I work as a senior lecturer in the State University in Kyiv, and less and less students use Russian. No lecturers are using, staff is forbidden of using Russian in university, for example. But of course, there are some local, like Kharkiv universities and Odessa universities. It will be hard to improve the situation with language. It's one of my biggest regrets as well, because when I made this choice to move from Russia to Ukraine, I knew that I would give up my relations with my wife. I knew that I will give up better salary and so on. But for me, it was the question of my survival. I never planned to become a Russian. All these people who just give up their past and they say, now I'm Russian. They are welcome in Russia. So there is no such a nationality as Russian. It's like a state of your mind that you are Russian. I know.
Go ahead.
I knew that I am Ukrainian. How can I become Russian? One of guys at one of these companies where I work, he said, like, you live in Russia for so long. How can you become Russian? And then another employee who was originally from Azerbaijan, his parents were, and he was born in Russia. Can you imagine this guy with a beard, pretty nice guy? He looked at my coworker and he said, like, how he can become Russian? He's Ukrainian. Because for him, who is from Azerbaijan, for him it's understandable that there is a nationality. And if your parents are Ukrainians, you are Ukrainian. For Russians, there is no such thing. You can come from Ukraine, you can be Ukrainian, but then you say, I'm Russian and you're Russian. That's one more strange thing.
That's what I was just going to go on and mention, and it's something that I've told my listeners, our subscribers on this channel. Ethnic identity in both Russia and Ukraine in regards to the Slavic population, it is not really clearly defined. And on the opposite end, I know plenty of people, we can even talk about our friend Misha Ivanov, for example, who he's definitely Ukrainian, even though he's of Russian origin. He speaks, like everybody in Priluki, the same language, and he sure as hell would not want to move to Russia. So, there's a lot of ethnic Russians, quote unquote, ethnic Russians who live in Ukraine, a lot of mixed families, a lot of, because in the Soviet Union, there were a lot of military bases, people moving around. So, it's almost like if you feel yourself Ukrainian, but you are an ethnic Russian, you can totally be Ukrainian. And some of the people that are the most nationalistic that I've met in Ukraine are of actually Russian origins, which is funny to me because it's like, and I've seen the opposite too. I have a friend, her surname's Tarasyuk, which is a very, any surname with the yuk at the end of it is usually very Western Ukrainian in origin. And
Russian.
Yeah, her father, who gave her that surname, lives in Donbass, now is living in Russia. When this invasion happened, he put the letter Z on his Facebook profile. He is so anti-Ukrainian. So and he hated the fact, him and her mother divorced when she was younger, and when she would come to stay with him, she hated when she would speak Ukrainian, and made her speak Russian. So a guy with this very Western Ukrainian surname and origin can be totally brainwashed into thinking he is Russian and believe it. I mean, embrace it. And there are tons of, like Kolya said, there are one of the biggest ethnic minorities in Russia, probably the biggest, is actually Ukrainian. But it's hard to even call them Ukrainians because they don't have that mentality. They have a Ukrainian surname. They have, at very best, maybe some grandparents that were, native Ukrainian speakers. I know of families, for example, in Russia, like, I have a friend who, his grandfather lived with them in Moscow. He was from Sumy region and would talk to my friend Pasha in Ukrainian. And Pasha just thought as a child that his grandfather was speaking funny Russian, is what he would call it. But later on, he realized it was Ukrainian. And because of that, Pasha could speak Ukrainian. So it's interesting. It's like a group of people that are divided by fairly small differences. Well, I wouldn't say small because they're big in some, they're big, in terms of believing one in freedom and one, versus sort of a collectivism. But what astounds me is, there's a lot of similarities, and despite these similarities, you have this horrible conflict. In a lot of ways, it is tragic for me because the hardest thing for me, is I have a lot of relatives in Russia. I don't have any that I know about right now in Ukraine. And luckily, my relatives in Russia, at least not all of them, but a good portion of them are pro-Ukrainian. They are definitely against this war. But there's a lot of such families, in Ukraine, and this war has actually absolutely separated them. It's divided them. They won't talk to each other, and it's horrible. That's one of the worst things about this. And for this alone, I think Putin is one of the most evil human beings on the planet. One of the most evil human beings in history.
In Ukraine, we have this joke that Putin did for Ukrainian national identity more than all Ukrainian presidents did before him.
He did more than
Putin united Ukrainians under one flag.
Yeah,
all Ukrainians who want their country to be independent, and all Ukrainians who are ready to fight for that. Because if you are not ready to fight for that, your opinion doesn't actually takes in count.
I want to.
You are just.
Interrupt here for a second for
Yes.
a pertinent update. It looks like the U.S. aid packages are going to a vote tomorrow in the House of Representatives. Procedural hurdles have been cleared, and someone finally tased Marjorie Taylor Greene and stopped her from adding amendments to the bill. So it looks like they'll be voting on it tomorrow.
Then
We are watching this news pretty close in Ukraine. Actually, in Ukraine, we might know more about United States news and political situations than citizens of United States. I have interesting point about the aid and way of giving it to Ukraine. So now we are coming to this part when war started. I was in Preluki, and as many of Ukrainians, I just didn't believe at all that war will start. Even when United States embassy said to all United States citizens to go back home from Ukraine, war will start. I thought it's all is a joke.
Kolya, do you remember when this was happening and I went home and you told your grandmother about it and she said something like, "Oh no, he's stupid for doing that. Nothing's gonna I forgot what she said, but it was something along those lines, like, why would he go
Yes,
home?
something like this.
Yeah.
Well, my grandmother, she was from Russia, and this the only relative line Russian that I have. So this one grandmother, she is her daughter, so she has pretty deep connection with Russia, and yes, she told me that actually I was thinking the same way, that nothing will start, nothing will happen, and then bam, at one day huge airstrikes, lots and lots of Russian vehicles. Like on the second day of this invasion, we had lots of vehicles that moved towards Kiev, and we saw them. And I understood that I should take my family out of Ukraine because I knew that Ukraine wasn't ready for this war. And after I realized that Russia was even less ready for this war, but I knew that everything can happen at this point, and Preluki and Chernihiv region is pretty close to Russia, so some part of Chernihiv region was occupied at this time. And after I managed to bring my family to the border, and they went to Poland and then to Germany, we started just to bring supplies to local orphanage and to take people like women and children out of our city to the western cities. That's how I spent first 3 months. Me and my father, we were driving all the time. First 3 months of invasion, and it was horrible. All these blackouts, when people are scared, when people they don't know how to react. This is crazy. When I remember it, you had to hide all the time in your house, turn your light off, and no one knew what was happening because there were no air defense systems. And like they show it in these movies about Second World War. People turn off their lights, so just no one could see their city from a plane. That's what we were doing. Live in total darkness, afraid to go outside after 6 p.m. And I was happy to go to the road to one more trip to bring something home. Then we started to bring medical supplies. We also went to the gray zones, like to Ichnya. At that point, it was gray zone. But soon enough, I was out of money, and all volunteering that you are doing, it's just for your own funds. And I understood that I have to take some rest. I went to my classmates to Vinnytsia, and life was so different there. There were people on the streets. They had lights all the time, and it was a strange difference. So yes, it's something I would never wish to other person to experience, to live in cities that is waiting to be attacked. We knew that Russians were like 15 kilometers away, and we were waiting for this attack. And we knew the only road that is still free that can lead us to Cherkasy. And when you cross this bridge, actually we never go Kiev because Kiev was surrounded as well. We had to drive to Cherkasy, and then we went to Lviv region where we found a place where people gave us supplies. That were hard times. But after that...
I remember it very well because I was sending funds to help you with that. Explain, if you feel like it, please explain some of the problems with local corruption that happened during that time.
Actually, yes, thank you for that help, because at some point we didn't even had money to buy gas for our car, and we knew that we need to make it back home. About corruption in local, it's at that point it wasn't even about corruption. It was about the lack of experience, about the lack of education, and yes, it was caused by corruption in any case. So people they were not ready. In the first 3 days of war, our administration, our president, and so on, they just stay silent. You won't find in the internet any like news where they show president and so on. They were hidden in the bunkers. So what people did, a lot of people came back, former military people, they came back from abroad. They didn't have any official position, and they just took firearms, and they started to fight. That's why we still have Ukraine, and we can walk on our streets, because there were a lot of volunteers, a lot of people who supplied army, a lot of people who joined army, and first 3 days was the hardest. If not for the bravery of Ukrainians, we won't just couldn't be able to talk right now about this, because I would be somewhere in immigration or dead or something like this.
Of course, yeah.
And as we started our conversation, where I tried to explain that our government, our politicians, and all these elites, these are oligarchs, corruptioners, and these people have to go to jail, like almost everyone. We live in a class system. I will never get there, because you have to be made like this, to betray your own principles, to join these people, go to this party. And it's not just about president and so on. Our president is a former actor. He is not even a politician. When I see Zelensky on a paper like Times, and he is proudly standing alone on the picture, and like he's doing all the fights, it's such a bullshit. People are dying every day. It's not Zelensky who is dying every day. He just plays his role. He just plays his role. And this Yermak, it's just the funniest thing I saw. How this guy going to United States and asking for money, and he says like, your money will be in good hands. What? They are stealing a lot of aids. Everyone knows it. They just steal a lot of aids. That's crazy about this war. That people, I truly believe that our government, it's like doing more bad things to this war than even our enemies. I had such a great hope that when this war started, our secret services will just clean up all the mess. They will get rid of all these oligarchs. But it appears that money won. Now I live in this country where they are speaking about new wave of mobilization. I know that we need to go to war. But our enemy is Russia. I mean, our is Ukrainian people's enemy. Ukrainian people enemy, Russia. Another enemy is oligarchs that just try to stay in control despite these heavy casualties, despite the lack of ammunition they created themselves, and they just want to bargain with West, give us more money. They ask for $60 billion more, not for ammunition. They ask for money because then they will be able to make it disappear. And hundreds, thousands of Ukrainians are dying every single day to pay off this price for this aid.
Well,
actually, I don't want to make things like dark at this point. I really believe. From other point, I see another help that is coming from different organizations directly to Ukrainian NGOs. And that is pretty great job, because there are people who are not involved in corruption and so on. And to help these organizations locally, different small cities and so on, is the best way to help Ukrainians, not to help Ukrainian government to get rich.
So my
Yes, sorry.
understanding of this, and we're getting a little bit in the chat too. My understanding of this is that there's kind of two types of aid. There's direct cash, uh, but they're all but a lot of aid is directly in the form of military supplies. So I kind of want to ask a couple clarifying questions here. Are you saying that military supplies are being sold and that's being turned into cash to turn into cash that people can then launder in other ways? Is that what you're saying?
You can't put my words to a bank. That's what I was told from people I know in the military, that
Okay.
they even sell ammunition.
Okay. Yes. So, yeah, I'm not asking you to be definitive on that, because this is a ongoing discussion here in the States. People saying, yes, Ukrainians are buying beach houses, blah, 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 blah. And then everyone encounters with, because what we're doing tomorrow is we're going to be spending a not insignificant amount of money to buy new equipment for us, and we will send you our old equipment, is kind of how it works on a certain level. And then there is cash aid happening. One of the things I kind of want to highlight too is there are groups, and we've seen a couple, who are volunteers. They raise money and they make sure they are directly supplying military units with needed equipment.
That's the best way to do it.
Yes.
Directly supply military units they personally know.
That's why, when this war started, I was sending, my donations to Kolya because I knew it would go into the right hands. And he was I remember you were actually calling me to let me know where it went every time. And I'm just like, dude, you don't have to call me. It's getting kind of, no offense, I was like getting almost annoyed with it, but you were so honest with it. And I was so happy that, I was knowing where it was going. About the aid disappearing, I mean, and I see Lucy's kind of, has some comments, some interesting comments, but like, it doesn't surprise me that they would be selling ammunition. I don't know how large this scale is, but the fact that someone told you that, Kolya, that doesn't surprise me at all. A lot of people have to remember, when they see this war, what Ukraine, the problems Ukraine faced even before it. And that's why I was glad, Kolya, that you brought up, the kind of history of organized crime and corruption in Ukraine, because it is a factor. It is a factor that could cost, if it's not adequately combated, it could cost Ukraine this war. And I think that it is important.
Totally.
It is important to bring this up and we'll raise awareness for it. I don't think Kolya is saying that, we shouldn't be giving Ukraine aid. Of course, Ukraine needs air defense. It needs these missiles. It needs artillery ammunition. And, God willing, it'll happen, tomorrow or within the coming weeks, that we'll be able to at least supply Ukraine what it needs to survive. But, there is another battlefield. There's two battlefields. And this is what Kolya is saying. There is the battlefield, against the Russians. And then there's the battlefield against corruption in Ukraine. And unfortunately, Ukraine, it's not like a country, for example, and I know, forgive me for using this as an example. I'm using them as an example because they have fought wars of survival. And in their early history, you would not have seen this level of corruption of within the armed forces in Israel as you do now in Ukraine. Ukraine has a lot of the same problems that Russia does in its armed forces. It's just something that you don't see. And I think that there's a problem to a degree as to how Ukraine is portrayed in the media in the United States. On one end, you have people like who, you know, view it as some sort of magical place. You have even, God, you know, forbid, like great scholars like Timothy Snyder, who has these magical views of Ukraine. You know, whenever he goes to Ukraine, he just talks with, you know, his intellectual friends and visits Lviv and Kiev. Lviv and Kiev.
Snyder is beautiful. I recommend everyone to hear his lectures about Ukraine. I enjoyed them a lot.
Yeah, you enjoy him, but I know this guy personally. I know like the academic community, and he's great. He's good in terms of his as a historian. What he's not good at is understanding how Ukrainians live. He doesn't understand the problems that are there, and he has a very rosy view as to what Ukraine is. So you have on one end Timothy Snyder. On another end, you have people who are saying that Ukraine is, you know, completely corrupt, a Nazi country, all this. Like, so in the Western media, you have these two opposing sides, you know, that are like, you know, one extremely positive and the other overtly negative. We don't really have a good picture of what Ukraine is really like. And also, to me, another thing that I don't like to hear, I don't like to hear when people are saying, oh, we have to, when they're peddling this, that we have to supply Ukraine to beat Russia only because, you know, we're going to fight Russia. Russia, if they win in Ukraine, will go into the Baltic states. They're not going to fucking go into the Baltic states. I mean, that's, let's just face it, that is not going to happen. We should be supporting.
I don't know about it.
Yeah, I don't agree. I don't agree.
I thought that they will never go to war with Ukraine as well. So now,
but there's a big difference when you have Article 5 on your side versus, you know, being pretty much you know, defenseless. Also, you have to remember too the way that Russia views Ukraine. It views Ukraine and Belarus all as a single nation, and they view Kiev as their spiritual homeland, like you know, where Russian quote unquote civilization originated. So, you know, it has more importance for them.
But so
we should be helping.
States.
No, not in that same
degree,
regard.
But they still
nearly to the same degree.
They still are. They still are considered part of Russia, part of the Soviet Union in particular. There isn't like here's the thing. It gets back to what I was talking about before the war and saying Russia won't invade because they haven't amassed the forces to succeed in this way. You're not going to take a country roughly the size of Texas with 200,000 guys in 3 weeks before the ground turns muddy. That was my basic argument back before the invasion in 2022. And like, just because it's not military tenable doesn't mean they won't try to do it. Russia invests a considerable amount of effort into sowing disunity into European countries and into the United States. There's a paper that I really think you should read about a concept called liminal warfare. And it kind of links into the Jeremotsov version of war. The concept of this idea that it's not tenable, so they won't do it, is it's a mistake we've made here in the past. I don't think that it's the same.
No, I agree with you there.
I don't think.
Yeah.
I don't like. Here's the answer. I don't know. What happens in November here really determines the efficacy of NATO going forward. If Biden is reelected, then I think we're probably safe. But if Trump is reelected, there's an excellent chance that the European alliance dissolves, and then these countries are really on their own. They're the defense strategy.
No, then I would be worried about them. Yeah, then I would be worried about them. The
strategy they have right now is insufficient without the prospect of the United States and Canada riding to their aid. And like, it's a different situation than it was in the Cold War too. Like it's a winnable war, where in the Cold War I'm not sure it was. So like the concept that Russia's not going to do something because it's stupid isn't a good one, because they clearly invaded Ukraine when they could not win.
Yeah, no,
I want to make 2 points today, 2 more points about these 200,000 people. I totally agree. I had this feeling that they will stop this madness after the first 100,000 casualties, and they didn't. And now they have almost 500,000 casualties. How much more man can they spend? It's crazy. For me, it's like insane, totally insane.
They're already past the point of demographic no return. I apologize, I was unclear. I was referring to the force they amassed for the initial attack, which was about 198,000.
Yeah, I understand. I understand. Okay. And at that point, I thought that they will stop after the 100,000 casualties, like dead and wounded, and they didn't. And for me, it's like, I don't understand. I'm afraid of these things that I don't understand. And the next point is like, if they can spend so many of their own people that they consider Russians, what do you think will be next after Ukrainians won't get this weapon? After Russia wins, what they will do next? Because from my perspective of a person who lives in Ukraine, first, all those activists will be eliminated, like momentarily. Anyone who posted anything at Facebook. We can see that happened in occupied cities like Kherson. They were tortured and killed and buried in mass graves. And the second thing, they will just want to get rid of any Ukrainian man because they is a potential threat. They couldn't do it in 400 years, just take away this idea of Ukrainian independence and independent state. And they will make of Ukraine this marionettic state that is totally controlled from Moscow, but they will say it's like, it's Ukraine, it's not we. We are not attacking Poland with this million-man army. We just took their wives and children hostage and just make them to fight. That's what can happen. War changed, times changed. They changed just when Russia attacked Ukraine and when Russia attacked Georgia as well. Now we see totally different war. And when my students in universities, they ask, did Russia hear about international law that declares how war should be fought? Why do they bomb like hospitals in Chernihiv? I say to them, we have a different war now, undeclared war. And Russia wants to make it a part of war. Bombing civilian objects is a way to make people go as refugees to Europe. They already did it once in Syria. They made this migrational crisis. A lot of people from Middle Asia, they moved to Europe, and it was a crisis. People were drowning on a boats trying to cross this sea. But what Putin didn't expect it, that Ukrainians will actually be welcomed in Europe. I spoke with a guy from England 2 weeks ago. It's one of volunteers whom I find and asked to join our English classes in university. And he told that he would prefer there a lot more of Ukrainians than any other countries, because Ukrainians are hardworking and they are easily blend into the English society. They learn language very fast, they work, and they are pretty nice people. That's what I heard from a person who came from England a few months ago to Ukraine. And I believe that. There are millions of Ukrainians in Germany. Tell me about one accident where some mass shooting or stabbing in church and so on. I don't think there was one. Well, one Ukrainian woman was killed by Russian girl and her German husband. It happened. But Ukrainians, they are welcomed everywhere they go because they are nice. We are nice people. So that was one thing that Putin didn't count on. He expected this migrational crisis in Europe, and it didn't happen.
I think, honestly, though at the same time, and, at the same time, the migration crisis, it also, it's, and me and you, Kolya, have talked about it, it creates problems for Ukraine, because how many of these people, are going to have the incentive to come back even in the best case scenario, when this is over. That's
Great
my
point.
yeah, that's my fear.
But now remember what we started this conversation with: corruption. And people in Ukraine, they, especially from Western Ukraine, they don't run from war itself. They finally got this opportunity to try and live a better life in other countries. When people make the decision to leave Ukraine, it doesn't mean that their house was destroyed by a bomb.
Of
It
course.
just means that they don't see future for their children in this after-war Ukraine.
They don't
Because
see.
a lot of people don't believe that Ukraine will win easily and this war will finish in nearest future.
There's also the thing too where, you know, you are more willing to fight for a society, for a government, and a society that has brought you some level of prosperity. And there's among a lot of Ukrainians, and it's kind of this mentality where I've lived in this country my whole life. I've witnessed, you know, it hasn't benefited me much. I've witnessed a lot of bad things, corruption, you know, and so forth. And there's just not the same loyalty to the state because you grow up in poverty. So they're like, you know, that's an issue that Ukraine faces. It actually, you know, needs to somewhat incentivize the need to fight. There are people who understand, I think rather rightfully, if you don't fight, then the consequences, you know, are going to be terrible for your family and stuff like that. I do not, and Kolya, I agree with you. And, you know, the people who have done the most, you know, activism, if Russia were to take over Ukraine tomorrow, those people are definitely already on a list. If not, they will be put on a list. And they'll be arrested. At minimum, they'll be sentenced to 10 years or some exorbitant term, and at worst, they'll be shot. You know, so that's like, you know, that is what awaits Ukraine if they lose. But, you know, there's a lot of people who just don't have loyalty to Ukraine because growing up there, they didn't benefit from, you know, living there at all. And, you know, now that they have the opportunity where, you know, they have had some relatives in the United States who could now write them a, you know, affidavit so that they're sponsored, they're going to do that. They'll bring their children with them. And a lot of these people, they're not going to come back, even facing the hardships that they are facing here. I've seen it firsthand, you know, when they come here. It's not easy, but, you know, they'll find a way. Ukrainians are good survivors. If anything, that is what I've learned about Ukrainians, is they can literally, because of all of the bad events in their history, you know, surviving even this war. This is not the worst event in Ukrainian history. Far from it, actually. You know, you had in the last century, you had the major, you know, you had the Stalinist famine, and then you had the Second World War. So, you know, and even before then, you had the Civil War, you had the First World War, and you had, of course, you know, the wars during the Cossack period. So, you know, Ukrainians are a nation of survivors. And I think that, you know, for them to move abroad, even though it might not be that comfortable, like the people that I see returning to Ukraine more, you know, when I was working at my job, the ones that would, like, they just couldn't adjust, those were not young people. Those were like people my parents' age who tried it and they're like, you know, fuck this. I'd rather be, you know, under Russian bombs than trying to adjust to a new language in the United States and try to get by on, like, you know, $10 an hour, which is basically impossible in the Chicago area. So, like, you know, that's the people that end up going back. And that's not the future. The future is in children, and that is what scares me about this conflict. I also think here's the thing that I think too, and this is going back Oh, I agree with you, Lucy. Yeah, I'm just, I'm making generalizations here. The whole Kozak history is a lot more complex, and but yeah, anyway. But what one thing I would like to see, even more than okay, our aid is contingent, we'll make a loan out of this aid or anything. I don't care if Ukraine pays it back, but I think that there needs to be a realistic view of what winning in this war is, because I think we're long past the point where Ukraine has the capability to march all the way down to Crimea and take back all of this lost land. I just don't think that that's possible anymore. I think that we have to understand what winning is and what it will be, and we just don't. And my fear is, by throwing money and weapons at the problem, Ukraine can use the weapons, it can use it to survive, and that's what it needs. I'm all for that. But what I worry about is that ultimately Russia is going into this with, several advantages. It's a larger population, larger economy. I mean, it's kind of economy has problems, but they can sustain themselves with their relations with China and, the global South, India, and stuff like that. And it's going to take
I have an idea on that. You're saying right things about what winning is in this war, and I don't think it is achievable. First off, people who are running from this war and who are running from poverty and corruption, they are actually also running from mobilization. That's very important to understand. In Ukraine, we are tough in Ukraine. We are a post-Soviet country. We don't have all the social program, rehabilitation program, and so on. The only way you can go back from war is to be wounded, heavily wounded. Like if you don't have legs, then you don't go back to front line. That sounds crazy, but that's how it is. 2 years passed, and people just stay there, and they will stay longer and longer. That is some part of this big game played between Ukrainian corruption government and American government. When at the beginning of the war, American government tells our government, like, you have to change or you won't receive any money. And then they give us 30 tanks, and they just go, they go counteroffensive. It's not possible to win this war against Russia with 30 tanks and 70 Bradleys. It's not possible. You have to give Ukraine F-16s, like dozen of them, and you have to give a lot of
way more than a dozen
air defense system.
Yeah, way more than
a dozen.
And
I mean that it's just for us to fight back, to stop Russia from moving forward. For me, that is a great win, because Russians put a lot of efforts in all these defense lines. There are so many mines, tons of them, that it won't be enough 20 years to clean those fields. And for Ukraine, it's important to be supported, like for Ukrainian nation, for Ukrainian people. Stop Russians, give us so many weapons as we need. I mean, these weapons that is easily trackable. You can't sell F-16, stole and sell it to someone else. That's what's important. Give this high advanced weaponry. Ukrainians, stop Russians. And there will be a great potential of Ukrainian military who have been through the hardest points, who have been through the front line. And these people, they will do the job, cleaning the oligarchs and so on. That's my hope. It might sound that I'm speaking about civilian war, or maybe I intentionally do it.
No, I don't think. Here's the thing. I want to reset some things based on what's going on chat. I don't think what you're saying is that don't send aid. And I don't think what you're saying is that all the aid is being swallowed up by corruption. However, to what Lucy is saying about aid being tracked, I have not inconsiderable experience with military tracking of equipment here in the United States. For example, if there is a formation of troops training and everyone has to be unarmed for something like meals or whatnot, an armed guard stands over those rifles. Things like this happen, but and we have armories and lockdowns and all kinds of things designed to prevent people weapons from going missing. But hundreds of thousands of weapons here in the United States on supposedly secure military bases go missing every year and fall into criminals' hands. Uh, Not hundreds of thousands, but a not insignificant portion of American stock goes missing. Even in a system, a peacetime system of a military that's the best funded military in the world, stuff gets lost, stuff gets stolen. These things happen. It's not beyond the pale to have a situation where it could be happening in Ukraine, particularly in a somewhat fluid situation about logistical priorities. And I think you're right. I think the equipment that's coming has been insufficient for the task at hand. 100 F-16s, I think 144, 2 wings worth of F-16s. I would be flabbergasted if Ukraine actually has fully operational squadrons right now with the age of the fighters, how the casualties, things like that. No, they definitely need help in this regard.
That, and the thing is an F-16 is, especially the variants they're getting, it's a fairly old and, by modern standards, I wouldn't say obsolete, but it's an older system. It's nothing that the Russians necessarily couldn't counter. It would help, but it's not going to. It's not. There's no game changer here that we can really give them
extensively. Yeah, there's nothing like we are at a point where the war is a grinding war of attrition. And the lack of ability of either side to gain air superiority over the other. To a certain extent, Russia's able to bomb Ukraine pretty much at will based on their bombers and their drones. But like Russian planes don't fly, is my understanding. They don't fly over Ukrainian-controlled territory because they will get shot down. They launch their missiles from outside of Ukraine into Ukraine proper. So like the inability of either side to gain air superiority has been a huge defining role in how this war is fought, because we make a lot of assumptions here in American military communities about our ability to act on the battlefield that are based off of our ability to build air supremacy, to own the skies and to stack up fighters and bombers and just annihilate anything that might mass to oppose us. And yeah, you're right, Lucy. The aid comes too late. Like by the time we have identified a need and supplied it, it's too late for it to have a substantive impact. Particularly on the stalemate that has emerged in the last over the winter. So I think it's important to note that like it is important to give Ukraine aid. It's a statement, but it could be more than a statement. We could do a better job of giving aid. We could give Ukraine the weapons they need to bring Russia to the table. And like I get that winning isn't going to be we're going to take back the Crimea and Luhansk and Donetsk. However, the Ukrainian government has to have a maximalist goal. They have to sit down to, if they're going to negotiate, they have to sit down and say, we want this. And then they have to peel it back.
This is a question of the burned ground. The only way to bring Russia to the negotiations is to show that they will be eliminated or they will negotiate.
Yes.
That's the only way.
Yes. We are we are hitting almost a 2-hour mark now. So I want to give you an opportunity to kind of give us any closing thoughts, and anyone who has questions, go ahead and throw them in chat, please.
As a lecturer on cybersecurity, I'm not a military. I notice a lot of like crazy information campaigns against Ukrainians. That Ukrainians are acting like filthy rich bastards in Europe, and they just do inappropriate things. They run from Ukraine and so on. For us, for Ukrainians, I especially mean myself and people like me, there are ways like to pay off and run, fled, leave Ukraine, but it's our choice not to do this. I don't think that it was the right thing to close border and not let men out, but I don't really think that a lot of men would just do it. Everyone who wanted, they went. And Ukrainians, they are doing their best. Just ordinary civilians and on the front lines, those people are heroes. It's very important to everyone to understand the situation, that Ukrainians have these two wars, war with Russia and war with corruption, with all these elites we have from 90s. And we are in a very bad situation. This is very unfair mobilization. When you go to Kyiv, people are visiting restaurants, and in villages, in some of these villages, there are no men left of this age, like more than 20 years old. It's crazy what you can see nowadays in Ukraine. So it is very important to understand what is happening and to support Ukrainians, to find ways to support the small organizations that are working with veterans. For example, I'm involved in few educational projects. One of them I'm running by my own, and education is the second important thing after war. So, point I want to make: stay safe, support Ukraine, and with God's help, everything will sort out.
Yes, go ahead, Hetman.
Cool. Yeah, I also wanted to ask you, what is the best way? You know, also maybe one thing, you know, you could put on our, like, send us, you know, so we like what are ways that our viewers can help Ukraine, you know, and how would you recommend that they do it? Because a lot of people in the United States, they give to certain NGOs that, you know, they're not sure if their money's getting to the right place. As you know, you and I have talked about, the only way I do it now is give to people I know, like yourself, or, you know, other friends. You know, that's my way of giving to Ukraine. Can you give some advice to our viewers on what's the best way for them to do it?
One of the best ways actually is to do this information campaign in support of Ukraine. And another, you say it right. There are a lot of organizations, and sometimes it is pretty hard to understand which organization is honest organization, which is not. There are some, mostly drones. For example, famous bloggers like Stronenko. They are doing great jobs, and all that things that should be done by the government and by our state, they are done by this kind of people who have audience. He has raised so many money to buy drones for Ukrainian military. It's crazy that a single person could do it only with a YouTube channel. But yes, mostly donating to famous bloggers who all the time show what and where did they bought for which military. Donating to drones is the best way.
All right.
Remember this name, Sternenko.
All right. I want to thank you for coming on today, Kolya.
We didn't even get to the interesting stuff about Priluki, which we'll have to have you on sometime to tell you a little bit about the beginning of the war there, and you know, just some of the kind of like there, honestly, Kolya, I think a movie could be made about your life during that period. It was so crazy.
a lot of more interesting people than me. Anyway, it was very nice to join you and to have this conversation. Now I'm motivated to run my own YouTube channel and TikTok channel and to tell people about things that are happening in Ukraine, because there is this fancy stuff about romanticizing Zelensky, and there is this reality that we live in. And these are pretty different things.
You want to know a really, like, if Zelensky were to say, something bad were to happen to him, and I'm not advocating that, he would actually be more useful as a symbol, because I think it would be kind of interesting for me.
All right, I'm going to stop you. I'm going to stop you right there. We are going to be. I will be back in a couple hours later this evening, possibly with Commander McMillan, to talk about Iran and Israel, because I can't really hold off on that. Before I want to try to get in front of it before that pops off. I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight, and have a good one.
All right, have a good one, people.
Good night. Bye.